Oh, whaley, whaley up the bank, and whaley, whaley down the brae, and whaley, whaley yon burnside, where I and my love want to gae. I leaned my back until an ache, thinking it was a trusty tree. But first it bent and syne it brak, say my true love did lie to me.
Hey everyone, welcome to A Maker's Pilgrimage, a podcast about contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts. I'm Aidan, the knitting monk, coming to you from Holy Cross Monastery in New York's beautiful Hudson Valley. Welcome back to those of you who have been viewers in the past. I'm so glad you decided to join me again. And for those of you who are watching for the first time, welcome. I hope that you will find what you're looking for here. You can find me on a variety of media. On Instagram and Ravelry, I am Knitting Monk. I write a weekly blog of contemplative Christian meditations, which you can find at groundinginthespirit.wordpress.com. And you can also check out my community, Holy Cross Monastery, at holycrossmonastery.com, where you will find information about our life and also about retreats that we have coming up and all those kind of fun things. So as I said, I'm glad you're here. Pull up your knitting or your sewing or whatever you're working on, something warm to drink, and we'll dive right in. This week, what I really want to talk about is the topic of humility and how that relates to spirituality, ecology, and fiber arts. Humility is an absolutely foundational element in Benedictine life. The Rule of Benedict, which is the 6th century Italian rule that we follow here at the monastery, humility forms the largest portion of that rule. The chapter on humility is 4 or 5 times as long as the next longest chapter. So it really is a big part of Benedictine spirituality. A lot of people, when they hear humility, think of self-flagellation or humiliation, really. But humility, as we practice it here at the monastery, is what I like to call standing in the light of the truth. And that's the way that my novice master taught me about humility. It's not about making yourself less than you are, but it's about actually being who you are. So that means that some parts need to get bigger and some parts need to get smaller. So the word humility comes from the same root as humus, earth, and also as human. So a human is one who is from the earth, the humus, and to be humble or to live into humility is to live into humanity and also to our earthliness. So it's not to be an angel. In fact, my spiritual director reminds me sometimes that when the body gets really noisy with instinctual hungers, or when all of your brothers in community or your spouse or your children or whoever it is that you're in relationship with start to really, really annoy you, these are both different ways that you're being called back to the reality that you're a human being. You're not an angel. You don't have the wings. You don't have the halo. So humility is about being in right relationship with myself, with other people, with God. And simply put, it's about living into the truth. Humility, from a spiritual point of view, humility really is grounded in obedience. Um, and its final flowering is in simplicity. So it starts with obedience and it kind of moves towards simplicity. So what do I mean by that? I mean that obedience, the word obedience really means to listen. I forget exactly what the Latin is, but it's a word that means to listen. So to obey really, first of all, means to listen, that I'm open and engaged with the people in my life, with God, with the environment, with my own inner voice, with the circumstances that arise in my life, and I'm listening for the truth in all of those voices and in all of that input that's coming to me. And then it takes it further into what we think of obedience as my response when I hear the truth. So an obedient response is a response that's listening, and then when I hear the truth, I respond with acceptance, and allow that truth to then change me in some way. And its final flourishing, humility's final flourishing, is in simplicity and directness. So I think about transparency, for instance, and if you know those people, generally they're really old people who they've just become themselves by the end of their lives, and there's no kind of artifice about them. The distance between their inner reality and who they present to the world has shrunk to almost nothing. They're transparent in that way. To my mind, those are the kind of people who most embody humility, because they're content to be who they are, which means they're aware of their shortcomings, and they're aware of and live from their gifts as well. So humility is not about denying my gifts. In fact, for many people, humility is about accepting and living into my gifts, and not living from the place of overinflation of the ego self. Humility really asks the questions, who am I? What do I have too much of? What do I not have enough of? What do I need more of? So maybe I have too much impatience and I need some patience, or maybe I have too much self-critique and I need more gentleness with myself. So this really touches on some of the comments that I've gotten from you all in the last couple of episodes, which really, their variations on a theme of balance is how I've seen them, and people saying things like, oh, my knitting used to be so enjoyable, but it's become a project that I have to do, a task that has to get done, and I want to come back to the kind of meditative qualities there. Humility is, again, the obedience is listening for things are out of balance, and responding by coming back to center. I had a yoga teacher who used to say, no matter how far down the wrong path you've gone, you can turn around and walk back. When I started to think about this and plan out this episode, I had, thousands of quotations and poems and all this kind of thing. So I'm going to dive into some of those, and we'll see what kind of comes out of it. But Irenaeus of Lyon, who I think is maybe 2nd century, 3rd century Christian writer, he said most famously that the glory of God is the human person fully alive. That's what humility is. Humility is I continually search out what is truest about myself, and I live into that, and I'm fully alive. It's if you know the story of the Velveteen Rabbit, who is this stuffed animal rabbit, who by the end of his life is worn thin, but he's real. He's made real through all that love. So I think sometimes people who want to be spiritual get exhausted, because we think, and I'm one of these people, that becoming spiritual or holy or whatever is about becoming better, about becoming good and living into that. But it's really not. It's about becoming real. It's about letting all the extraneous stuff fall away so that I am fully myself, which rests on the understanding that there's never been another person who is exactly who I am, and there never will be another person who is exactly who I am. So to give you an example of what I mean, I've got two examples. One is from the Hasidic tradition in Judaism, and another is a story from my own life. So the Hasidim tell a story about Rabbi Zusha, who was concerned about whether he was living into the fullest expression of who he was, and he was talking to some of his disciples, and he said to them, I know that when I die and I meet God, God is not going to say to me, Zusha, why weren't you more like Moses? God is going to say, Zusha, why weren't you more like Zusha? And I love that story, because even though we can take inspiration, and I think we do take inspiration from all kinds of sources and people, and experiences, we want to be like so-and-so because they embody certain qualities that we admire. My path is not to be that person. My path is to be me. And if I see wisdom or humility or gentleness or courage or whatever in somebody else, it may be that I need to take that into my life, but it will be expressed in my life as me, not as that person. That is what humility is about. Being humble enough to own my shortcomings and my gifts together, and to live the one life that only I can live. As David White says, who's a poet, in one of his beautiful poems called All the True Vows, and part of it goes, there's only one life you can call your own, and 1,000 others you can call by any name you want. The sense that there's only one life that's my life, and it doesn't matter what all the other lives are. You can call them whatever you want, because they're not the one life that is my life. So to give you another example from my own life, so when I was applying to colleges, it was really important to me that I go to a top tier school. I needed that kind of validation. I'd always been smart, but I had always felt like there was really something lacking in me, and I never quite believed that I was smart. And so I applied to colleges, and I got into Yale, and I chose Yale for school. And I look back now, and I think I would have flourished in another environment. And I did fine in college. It wasn't about that, and I made great friends and that kind of thing. But at the time, that was the only choice I could make because of who I was and what I needed. But it wasn't the kind of environment that encouraged me. It was an environment that, in many ways, had a training to become famous and powerful and successful, to continue the status quo. And I certainly dove right into the midst of that element when I started college. And I wanted to be famous, and I wanted to be powerful, and I wanted to be somebody. And so I tried to go down that route and take the kind of classes that people who were going to be in politics and business were taking. Um, and I fell into a really deep depression. And my sophomore year of college, I was severely depressed for the first half of the year into the second half. And there were two things that were going on. One was that I was trying to live this life that wasn't me. Um, no matter how much I tried, I couldn't care enough about politics and economics to make that my life and make being successful in those arenas my life, becoming an investment banker and having a lot of money and all of those kind of things that so many of my classmates were doing. And I wanted that on some level because I wanted to feel okay. And I thought that that would make me feel okay. But it didn't, because I wasn't living into the truth of who I was. And the other thing that was going on there was I had always been the smartest person around, or one of them. And when I got to Yale, I was just totally average. And granted, average at Yale is very smart. But within the context that I was in, I didn't stand out. And that was really, really, really hard for somebody who was used to standing out. But what I was able to do as I came out of that depression was to begin to pay attention to who I really was and what the deepest desires were in my heart, where I was drawn, what kind of studies I was actually interested in, what kind of life was being called forth from me that was authentic to me. And when I started to live into that, it didn't suddenly matter as much that I wasn't the smartest person in the college, that I was average for the first time. And so, that was a really, really incredible lesson for me, because it opened me up to, certainly after I graduated from college, opened me up into exploring other parts of who I am that are not based up here and in my intelligence, but really have allowed me to live into other expressions of who I am that then I can integrate with intelligence, certainly. That doesn't go away, but it brings together, my heart and my head and my body and all the rest of it. So that's a little bit from my own story and my own kind of listening and then living into the truth that I've heard, which is a kind of humility. So how does this play out in an ecological context? Well, I think a lot of it goes back to some of the things that I have said in the previous two episodes. When we live in a world that is dominated by untruth, which is the opposite of humility, then we live out of balance with the earth community. So if you take, for instance, this emphasis on being young and attractive, right? Attractive, whatever that means, Because the truth is, everybody's attracted to something different, But we have this image of what is good or attractive or valuable that's put forward in our media, and we all buy into it. I mean, I buy into it as much as anybody else does. And then that encourages us to spend and to buy and to consume, rather than to be satisfied with what we have. So that's, and then that in turn kind of cycles out into the planet. But if you think about humility as being connected to what is human, which is being connected to what is earthly, then humility is about being grounded in my body. It's about knowing what it's like to be in my body as one body that's a part of this whole planet. Um, a lot of it, I think about aging, for instance. There's this whole culture, as I mentioned, of youth and an emphasis on youth. Um, and so, what have we done? We've forgotten what the gifts of aging are. I mean, people of my generation have very few role models and mentors, because to be a role model or a mentor, you have to acknowledge that you have experience, that you have wisdom, that you have lived life, which means you're not 20 years old. It's not that 20-year-olds can't be role models, but you're somebody who has lived a while, So to accept and live into the gift of being older requires an acceptance of being older, which then allows you to be a mentor and to capitalize on your wisdom and to pass that wisdom on, which is really the spiritual discipline of being older. When you're younger, when you're my age, the spiritual discipline is kind of harnessing the energy to create and to build. Now, of course, that continues in older years too, and wisdom, you see wisdom in people my age as well, so it's not evenly split like that. But when you have a culture that so emphasizes youth, then where's the wisdom, Where are the wrinkles that have been earned, the gray hair that has been earned, and hallelujah? Where is the gratitude for being alive and for having learned lessons and for having grown and deepened and changed over the years? And for providing that example for my generation and for younger generations. Young people need older people to be older, so that we have some healthy model of what that looks like. Just as I think older people need younger people to pass the wisdom on to, and also to draw some of that energy for creation from. So again, to connect this in a more direct way to the ecological portion, I think about some of the indigenous wisdom that comes from our Native American traditions, and they talk about humanity, human beings, as the younger brothers and sisters of the natural world. And, evolution and evolutionary sciences tell us that human beings are the most recent creatures in terms of evolution. And the indigenous stories say the same thing, that the human being was created last. And actually the Judeo-Christian story says the same thing in Genesis, the creation myth. And so there's this sense of like, would you allow your youngest child to run your household all by themselves without the input from the elders? And so why should humanity be running the entire show on the planet without the input from the elders? Humility in the ecological context would suggest that as the youngest, we human beings have something to learn from our elders. So just to give one example of that, I think about the forests, right? And you have these forests, these ancient forests, although not nearly as many as we could have if we hadn't cut them all down. But the more we learn about forests, the more we learn that it doesn't make sense to speak of a single tree, because you have to speak of the whole forest as one organism. Trees have grown so that and evolved so that they're not only interdependent with one another, but they're also interdependent with the rest of the life forms within the forest ecosystem. So they actually communicate and share resources, tree to tree, via a network of fungi underneath the soil. That's amazing. They communicate via pheromones on the wind. They help to raise one another's young. They distribute resources when one is dying. There are all of these things that we could learn from trees and forests, if again we go back to that obedience piece and we listen for the truth and we allow that truth to change, to soften, to shape us. So the result of all of this work of humility is, as I said before, we become ourselves. There's a wonderful quotation from Thomas Merton, and I promise I am going to get to fiber arts, that's next, but a wonderful quotation from Thomas Merton about what he calls the true self, capital S self, which is this piece of us that is being born as we live into humility. And you may have heard this, but this is what he says about this part of us. He says, at the center of our being is a point of nothingness which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness and of absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It is, so to speak, God's name written in us as our poverty, as our indigence, as our dependence. It is like a pure diamond, blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody, and if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I have no program for seeing. It is only given, but the gate of heaven is everywhere. I love that. A pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. That we each have this piece of us that is radiant, absolutely radiant, and all we have to do is stop and let that light come out. And there's actually nothing we can do to dim that light, that piece is not accessible to our will or our fantasies. And the more we live into that, the more we're able to be intimate with one another, because we can disclose who we really are, and we have the space to receive the other as other. So what does all this have to do with fiber arts, right? Isn't this a fiber arts podcast? And it is, yeah. So to get to some examples from how I live into humility and how I'm learning to live into humility from the fiber arts practices that I engage in. Some of it is about tastes and preferences. Yes, learning my own tastes and preferences. But it's more deeply about cultivating practices of honesty in my life. And tastes and preferences are the beginning of that, but then it goes deeper and it kind of works on me. For instance, one of the ways that I practice humility with my making is that I have to be honest with myself about my body and what the size and proportions of my body are. And so, that moment when you're knitting a sweater and you realize that it's too big or it's too small, it's not going to fit you. And there's that agonizing moment where you just don't want to rip it out. And you could keep making it and squeeze into it or say, I'm going to lose weight, or I'll just have a big baggy sweater, or I'll give it to somebody else. I mean, I play all of these games with things when they're not working out to be the size that they're meant to be. But humility would say, my body is this size. I have certain measurements. I have, I'm long in some places and short in others. I'm wide in some places and not as wide in other places. And so humility accepts that. But it's also about saying, you know, what do I need in my wardrobe right now? I mean, and this is a spiritual practice and ecological practice and a fiber arts practice that's based in humility. To look at my wardrobe, my clothes, and to say, you know, here are the gaps. And so, even though I found this shawl pattern I'm really excited about, I already have 10 shawls. Maybe I don't need to make another shawl. Maybe I need to make this cardigan because I don't have a cardigan to wear. Um, which doesn't mean that we can't make things just for the simple joy of making them. That's a perfectly good reason to make something. Um, but it's also about being clear about why we're doing something, and being intentional about it. Um, so, the real example that's been standing out to me in my own making life recently is about cabled sweaters. So, you all will remember, um, no doubt, from many episodes, this cable monster sweater that I made. Um, if I had been honest with myself when I was making this, I would have said I hated it. I did not enjoy making this sweater. But I'm stubborn, so I didn't say that, and I pushed on and I finished it. And then, if I were honest about it after I was done making it and put it on, I would say, I don't really like it very much. But I wasn't honest, I was stubborn, and I pushed on. It's not that it's not a beautiful sweater. It is. I mean, this cable design is lovely. Um, it's complex. It's it's beautiful, but I don't like it for me. I don't like the way it fits me very well. Um, the design feels too much for me and my tastes. Um, and on top of that, I didn't enjoy making it. So I'm using this sweater as a lesson for myself in why did I make it then? Why did I push on with it? Um, and for me, it was all about ambition and ego. Um, I needed to, it was like when I chose to go to Yale and that was the only choice I could make, you know. I, I had to prove to myself that I could do it. It was one of those projects where it was the hardest thing I could find to make, and I had to make it so I could show myself and all of you that I could make it, that I could do it and finish it, and it would look beautiful. And I did, and that's great. And so, what do I have having done that? Well, I have 2 months of knitting time that was spent on that project, and 1,800 yards of worsted weight wool that was spent on that project, um, and a sweater that I don't particularly want to wear. Um, and the only kind of payoff from that is the little tiny ego boost that I get from knowing that I can make a sweater that's this complex. And from the praise that I get from people who see it and say, wow, that's so beautiful, I can't believe you made that. When I'm in a grounded place of humility, that payoff really isn't worth it. Um, it's also not great from an ecological point of view that I used up all that yarn for a project that I don't really like and don't want to wear. And then I spent that much time working on something, a project that I wasn't enjoying. So, humility in the moment would have been admitting to myself that I wasn't enjoying it. Humility at this point is looking back on the experience and unpacking it and making different choices in the future. So, what I have done with that is that when I very first started knitting, I saw the Timberline cardigan that at Brooklyn Tweed made by Jared Flood, and it's like this sweater. You know, it is a very complex cable pattern, all over cable pattern in a cardigan. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And I said to myself, I want to make that, and I will know that I have become an expert cable knitter when I can make that sweater. So I got the pattern recently as I was finishing the Cable Monster. I got the Timberline pattern and I ordered the yarn for it. And I was about to start working on it as my next project when I started to reflect on the Cable Monster and my experience of it. And I realized I don't need to prove to myself that I can make the Timberline sweater. I know I can make the Timberline sweater. It's a beautiful sweater, but it's not really something that I want in my wardrobe. I have learned with this Cable Monster sweater that I don't like wearing the all-over cables like that. I don't know how I would find the knitting process with Timberline because I'm in a different place, it's different yarn, it's a somewhat different pattern, but I didn't enjoy the process of knitting the Cable Monster. So it's possible that I also wouldn't enjoy Timberline. But more importantly, it's not something that I will want to wear, I think. So I made a different choice. And I cast on another sweater that's much simpler that I have also admired. And that is the Migration Cardigan by Stacy. I'll put it down here. I don't remember her last name, but it's another shawl-collared cabled cardigan from Brooklyn Tweed, but the pattern is very different. So this is the Migration Cardigan. So it's these rows of gull cables here. It's what she calls the ladder pattern, which is a lot of kind of alternating garter stitch and stockinette. And then there's garter on the side of the cables. It's beautiful, this beautiful texture. It's a pretty simple pattern. I mean, I'm not looking at any charts. I'm not really having to count rows. It's a 6-row repeat, and 2 out of the 3 right side rows are all knit. And the third one has the cables that happen. The wrong side is a little bit more complex, but again, it's all knits and purls on the wrong side in a regular, easy to memorize pattern. Now, is this as impressive as Timberline or the Cable Monster? I guess it depends on what you're looking for. But I can tell you, I'm loving the experience of knitting this. And it's a piece that will be really excellent in my wardrobe. I've been wanting another cardigan, and it's still cabled. It still has interest, both for the knitting and the wearing. But it's something that's much more me, that fits in with my aesthetic and with who I am. And so even though it may seem like a small thing, this is actually a spiritual practice and an ecological practice in being able to say, but this is what I need, this is what I want, this is who I am, and to live into that instead of the expectations that I've placed on myself. This is knit because I'm sure some of you will want to know, this is knit in Beaver Slide dry goods. They're in Montana. They're a merino farm in Montana. This is their worsted weight, 100% merino, undyed, in a light gray. And this is the best yarn. Oh my gosh, it's so soft. It's mule spun, which is an old-fashioned spinning process, very minimally processed yarn. I think they use all vegetable-based oils and soaps in the processing. And it's spun in this way that's very light and airy, woolen spun. And I'm told that it's like hand spun. I don't spin yet, but it's just really a delight, the pattern and the yarn. And so going forward, I really want to embody that kind of practice in my making. I want to look at what are the materials I have on hand, what are the gaps in my wardrobe, and what really is my aesthetic. What am I going to enjoy making? What am I going to enjoy wearing? and to leave the whole impressive thing and proving something to myself or to you on the side. I mean, part of humility is realizing that the past is the past. I can't go back and change it, but I can learn from it. So I won't say that I regret making the cable monster, but I don't want to make it again, and I don't want to make another one like it. So in practicing humility with my knitting, I'll get there step by step. Practice makes progress, as they say. So that is just a little example of humility in the fiber arts. The last piece of my reflection today on humility, and I realize this is going to be a shorter episode because maybe I have 5 more minutes here. The last piece of the humility with the fiber arts is that I've been asking myself, what do I do with this sweater now? Because I have this Cable Monster sweater, and I frankly don't want to wear it. So I thought, well, maybe one of you wants to wear it. So I am going to give this sweater away. We're going to have a giveaway on the Ravelry group. Head over to the Ravelry group. The link will be in the bottom of the YouTube video in the notes down there. I think it's ravelry.com/a maker's pilgrimage, or you can go to Ravelry and search for a maker's pilgrimage. But there will be a question there related to the topic today. I haven't come up with the question yet. And certainly by the next time I podcast, I will draw a winner, which will be in 3 or 4 weeks. And then I will send this to the person who wins. And you can do whatever you want to with it. You can wear it yourself. You can give it to somebody you love. Or you can rip it out and get the 1,800 yards of worsted weight yarn from it. Whatever you like with that. And then I'll know that it's in good hands. So yes, check the Ravelry group, and that will be our giveaway this time. It has been a pleasure to be with you all again. I had an excellent retreat, which I know a lot of you know that I was on silent retreat, so that's why it took me a while to get back to your emails and comments and all of that, but I really appreciate the support, and I look forward to talking with you next time. Just to end today, I will read you a poem that I think really embodies humility. This is from Marie Howe, who is a really incredible poet, and this is her poem called Magdalene, the Seven Devils, and it's all about the 7 devils that were cast out of Mary Magdalene, but it's also just about being a human being and living into what that means. So I look forward to speaking to you next time, and welcome any of your comments or questions on Instagram or Ravelry. My username there is Knitting Monk. And to finish out, here is Magdalene, the 7 Devils by Marie Howe. The first was that I was very busy. The second, I was different from you. Whatever happened to you could not happen to me, not like that. The third, I worried. The fourth, envy disguised as compassion. The fifth was that I refused to consider the quality of life of the aphid. The aphid disgusted me, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The mosquito, too, its face, and the ant, its bifurcated body. Okay, the first was that I was so busy. The second, that I might make the wrong choice, because I had decided to take that plane that day, that flight before noon, so as to arrive early, and I shouldn't have wanted that. The third was that if I walked past the certain place on the street, the house would blow up. The fourth was that I was made of guts and blood with a thin layer of skin lightly thrown over the whole thing. The fifth was that the dead seemed more alive to me than the living. The sixth, if I touched my right arm, I had to touch my left arm, and if I touched the left arm a little harder than I'd first touched the right, then I had to retouch the left, and then touch the right again, so it would be even. The seventh, I knew I was breathing the expelled breath of everything that was alive, and I couldn't stand it. I wanted a sieve, a mask, I hate this word, cheesecloth, to breathe through that would trap it, whatever was inside everyone else that entered me when I breathed in. No, that was the first one. The second was that I was so busy. I had no time. How had this happened? How had our lives gotten like this? The third was that I couldn't eat food if I really saw it, distinct, separate from me in a bowl or on a plate. Okay, that was the first. I could never get to the end of the list. The second was that the laundry was never finally done. The third was that no one knew me, although they thought they did, and that if people thought of me as little as I thought of them, then what was love? The fourth was that I didn't belong to anyone. I wouldn't allow myself to belong to anyone. The fifth was that I knew none of us could ever know what we didn't know. The sixth was that I projected onto others what I myself was feeling. The seventh was the way my mother looked when she was dying, the sound she made, her mouth wrenched to the right and cupped open so as to take in as much air, the gurgling sound so loud we had to speak louder to hear each other over it, and that I couldn't stop hearing it. Years later, grocery shopping, crossing the street. No, not the sound. It was her body's hunger, finally evident, what our mother had hidden all her life. For months I dreamt of knuckle bones and roots, the slabs of sidewalk pushed up like crooked teeth by what grew underneath. The underneath, that was the first devil. It was always with me. And that I didn't think you, if I told you, would understand any of this.